In 2019, Microsoft Japan gave their entire workforce Fridays off. Full pay, 4-day week, no reduction in expectations. Then they measured what happened. Productivity went up 40%. They published the data. Then they ended the experiment and went back to 5 days a week. That sequence, proof that less time produced more output, immediately reversed, is the most honest summary of why the 8-hour workday still exists. Not because it works, because it's the default. And what we're going to do in this video is examine that default, where it came from, what it's doing to the people living inside it, and why the evidence for replacing it is stronger than almost anyone in power wants to admit. To understand why the 8-hour day exists, you have to go back to 1817. A Welsh industrialist named Robert Owen coined a slogan: 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest. Factory workers at the time were pulling 14 to 16-hour shifts. Owen's proposal was a humanitarian intervention. Divide the day into thirds. Protect the body from physical collapse. Give the worker enough rest to return the next morning. The logic was simple because the work was simple. You operated a loom. You smelted iron. Your output was directly proportional to the hours you stood on the floor. More hours, more units. The clock measured productivity because the clock was productivity. Time in equaled output out. That formula spread. Henry Ford formalized it in 1926. The U.S. Fair Labor Standards Act codified it in 1938. By mid-century, the 8-hour day wasn't just a labor standard. It was the architecture of modern life. The problem is, what changed after 1938? Factories automated. The economy shifted. The dominant form of work in developed economies transformed from moving things with your body to solving things with your mind. Economists call this the knowledge economy. Jobs where the output is cognitive, strategy, design, analysis, code, writing, decisions. And here is where Owen's math stops working. In a factory, output scales with time. Run the loom for 8 hours, you produce more fabric than if you run it for 4. That relationship is linear and measurable. Cognitive output doesn't work that way. Creativity doesn't double because you sit at a desk for twice as long. Strategic thinking doesn't scale with hours logged. In knowledge work, 2 focused hours can exceed what you'd produce in an entire distracted afternoon. Owen's model was built for a world where time was the input. In the knowledge economy, attention is the input. Those are not the same thing. We just kept using the same clock. But it goes deeper than fatigue. There's a biological mechanism at work, and it has a specific name: social jet lag. Every person has a circadian rhythm, an internal clock that determines when your body is primed for alertness, focus, and rest. This isn't uniform across the population. People fall on a spectrum from strong morning types, who peak cognitively in the early hours, to evening types, who don't hit their cognitive ceiling until the afternoon or later. The 9 to 5 treats everyone as a morning type. It locks a universal start time to the clock, regardless of biology. For evening types, a significant portion of the workforce, this creates a permanent state of misalignment. Their biological clock says one thing, the work schedule says another. They spend their careers doing complex cognitive work at the exact hours their brain is least equipped for it. Researchers have measured the consequences: chronic cortisol dysregulation, degraded executive function, accelerated sleep debt. And here's the part that should land hard. Chronic sleep deprivation, which social jet lag reliably produces, is clinically linked to measurable drops in effective cognitive performance. Not slight drops, meaningful ones. The work schedule itself is suppressing the intelligence of the people doing the work, not because they're underperforming, because the structure makes underperformance the biological outcome. Layer in what those same depleted people are doing with their bodies for 8 consecutive hours. The research on sedentary behavior is unambiguous. Prolonged sitting, more than 8 to 9 hours daily, is strongly associated with metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and chronic musculoskeletal damage. The WHO has formally classified burnout as an occupational phenomenon tied to chronic, poorly managed workplace stress. This isn't about individual habits, it's about an institution. A structure designed in a pre-industrial medicine era that has never been reformed in response to what we now know about physiology. We updated building codes when we learned about structural risk. We updated safety regulations when we learned about physical hazard. We didn't update the workday. So what does actually work? The trial data from the last decade has been consistent enough to constitute something close to a verdict. Microsoft Japan, productivity up 40% on a 4-day week. Iceland ran one of the largest reduced hours trials in history between 2015 and 2019, involving over 2,500 workers, roughly 1% of the country's entire workforce. Output held steady or improved across offices, hospitals, and social service providers. Workers reported lower stress, better health, and sharper focus during working hours. Following the trial, the majority of Iceland's workforce either moved to shorter hours or gained the formal right to request them. In New Zealand, financial services firm Perpetual Guardian cut weekly hours by 8 and saw team engagement scores climb 40% and stress levels drop by 7%. The same pattern repeats across every serious trial. When you remove the time buffer, people don't become less productive. They eliminate the inefficiency the buffer was hiding. Meetings tighten. Distractions fall away. The work that actually matters gets done. The filler disappears. The 8-hour block was never a productivity floor. It was a container for waste. This brings us to the core confusion that keeps the 8-hour day in place. The model was never measuring productivity. It was measuring presence. In a factory, presence and productivity were the same thing. The machine ran because the body showed up. Remove the body, the machine stops. The math was clean. In knowledge work, presence and productivity are completely different variables. You can sit at a desk for 8 hours and generate almost no value. You can work in 2 sharp, focused hours and produce something that shifts the direction of an entire project. The relationship between time and output isn't linear. It never was in this kind of work. The persistent confusion between the two has a clinical name in organizational research: presenteeism. The idea that time in seat is a proxy for value created. And presenteeism is the central dysfunction of the modern office. We built entire performance cultures around a metric that, in knowledge work, measures the wrong thing entirely. The alternatives aren't theoretical. They're documented, tested, and available. 4-day work weeks, flex time with core collaboration windows, say 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., where the team overlaps but start and end times flex to match individual cognitive peaks. Output-based schedules that abandon hours entirely and measure only deliverables. Compressed work weeks that condense 40 hours into fewer days, reducing commute burden and extending genuine recovery time. Each model addresses a different failure of the 8-hour framework. Flex time corrects for social jet lag. Output-based work eliminates presenteeism. Reduced hour models force the elimination of low-value tasks that only exist because there's time to fill. None of these require a leap of faith. The data is there. Here's the bigger picture. Robert Owen's slogan, 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest, solved the right problem for 1817. Protect the body, limit exploitation, give the worker enough recovery to return tomorrow. For factory work, those were exactly the right design goals. But the knowledge economy doesn't run on bodies. It runs on minds. And minds don't work like machines. They fatigue differently, peak at different times, require rest in different ways, and produce disproportionate output when the conditions are right, not when the clock says so. We have the trial data. We have the biology. We have a growing body of public health research classifying the current structure as a hazard. The case against the 8-hour day isn't a productivity argument anymore. It's a scientific one. The only reason the model persists is inertia. It's the default. And as Microsoft Japan quietly demonstrated in 2019, even when the evidence points clearly somewhere else, the default is very hard to walk away from. That's not a productivity problem. That's a policy problem. And policy problems have a history of eventually getting solved. Once the cost of ignoring them becomes harder to justify than the cost of changing them. We may be closer to that point than the default wants us to think.